Good morning, HPC. It's hard to imagine a more pitiful sight than men on their way to be crucified. The whole point of crucifixion was it was such an unpleasant way to die that the millions of people who found themselves enslaved in the Roman Empire would think no matter how nasty and brutish and short my life is as a slave, it is at least better than dying death through crucifixion. Now, early on, the Roman Empire was swept by a number of servile wars, slave revolts, the most famous of which, I suppose, would be the one portrayed in Spartacus. But crucifixion was designed to say, no matter how bad your lot was, at least you're not being crucified. So we could well imagine that people would weep at the sight of men on their way to crucifixion. And we could well imagine that these women would weep as Jesus goes to be crucified. Perhaps he knew them. Perhaps they knew that he was innocent. And so these daughters of Jerusalem, as he refers to them, weep to see Jesus going to his death. It's all the more surprising that he doesn't grunt a word of thanks or even smile in gratefulness for their sympathy, but rather he says, "Don't weep for me, weep for yourselves." How strange that must have sounded. Sinclair Ferguson makes the point that although Jesus knew that the physical suffering that he faced was of a magnitude which we cannot imagine, it was time limited, and that his suffering was not pointless. Rather, his suffering was achieving eternal glory for all those who would trust in him. Jesus knew and had spoken about the fact that 3 days after his suffering, he would rise again to a glorious eternity. Not so for the women who were crying for him. He says in verse 28 of Luke chapter 23, "Cry for yourselves. Judgment is coming. And this judgment will be so horrendous, so awful, that people will wish they were buried alive in an avalanche. They will cry out, 'Please, please, can I be at the bottom of a landslip? It would be better than to face this judgment.'" Can you imagine what that must be like? I can't either. Jesus is referring to two things. The first he's referring to is the Roman siege and destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But that horrific destruction, and the contemporary accounts are terrifying, that horrific destruction of this city will be just the warm-up act for the main event, which is the righteous judgment of God for all those that will fall on all those who don't know and love Jesus. And then Sinclair Ferguson quotes from Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 to 17, on how terrible it will be to face the wrath of the Lamb at sin that will fall on all those who reject him. The truth is, sin will be judged. And if we're honest, we want sin to be judged. We read in our newspapers, we hear on the news of people, scammers, who are taking advantage of vulnerable people. And in this current climate, they're taking them to the cleaners. They're taking all of their money. And we think that is wrong. They shouldn't get away with it. Well, the Bible has a wonderful truth, which is they won't. They will face judgment. We pray they will be caught and stopped in this life. But beyond that, God will judge them. And we're pleased. What we don't want is for him to judge us. But sin will be judged either in the person of Jesus as he dies on the cross, enduring the wrath of God against sin for everyone who believes in him, or we ourselves will bear the cost of our sin on the last day when we stand before God. Easter is a time of huge joy because it celebrates salvation, but it's a time of serious joy because that salvation is the salvation from judgment. And in the face of that judgment, there is no safe place to hide ourselves except in the person of Jesus. Hope you have a really good Maundy Thursday, HPC.